Okay, so we've got step 1 being the gateway, step 2 is the minimum substance test, step 3 is the opportunity to rebut the shell presumption, step 4 is the exemptions, and step 5 is the adverse tax consequences. Got it. Okay, so let's dive into the detail. Shall we have a closer look first at step 1, the gateway?
The gateway is structured as 3 conditions. All of these conditions have to be met in order for the entity to pass through the gateway. There are also 5 gateway exclusions. If the entity qualifies for any of the gateway exclusions, it won't pass through the gateway either. An entity that doesn't pass through the gateway is outside the scope of the draft directive completely, and therefore none of the reporting obligations or adverse tax consequences will apply. The 3 gateway conditions are intended to identify entities that have geographically mobile cross-border activities and have outsourced their decision-making. Let's look at the first condition. This is looking to see whether the entity has geographically mobile income or is an envelope for certain property. The condition is met where either more than 75% of the entity's revenue in the previous 2 tax years is relevant income, or more than 75% of the total book value of the entity's assets are real estate assets and specified high-value private property or shares. Relevant income is essentially passive income, for example, interest, dividends, rental income, but it also includes income arising on the disposal of shares.
And I think it's also worth adding, Laura, the directive includes a deeming rule for equity holding companies, which essentially prevents those companies from arguing that because no dividends have been paid in the last 2 years, this condition isn't met, where the underlying equity shares represent at least 75% of the total book value of the holding company's assets. Effectively, this condition is just deemed to be satisfied.
Yes, that's right. Moving to the second condition, this looks at whether the income or assets are cross-border or offshore. And this condition is met where either more than 60% of the entity's immovable property and specified high-value private property is held offshore, or at least 60% of relevant income is from cross-border transactions. The third condition is that in the previous 2 tax years, the entity has outsourced its day-to-day administration and decision-making on significant functions.
I actually think that third condition is really interesting because when we were looking at the Jersey substance rules last time around, I think it was clear from those rules that outsourcing was generally permitted, provided the entity retains supervision over its service providers. And it's interesting to me that the EU's chosen outsourcing as effectively a quasi-indicator that an entity lacks substance. It seems to be 2 quite contrasting approaches there. And the other thing that strikes me about this condition is that the entity needs to have outsourced both routine administration and management. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, and I think that's also interesting because I would have thought that most entities would already have been making top-level management decisions in the member state in order to protect their tax residence position. And if that's the case, then maybe not many entities will actually end up passing through the gateway.
Maybe that will turn out to be true. Or perhaps some entities have been relying upon other factors, like place of incorporation, for their tax residence, and they haven't considered where they are centrally managed and controlled.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And actually, just looking back at the wording of the directive again, it asks whether the shell has outsourced decision making on significant functions. And I'm not sure I've seen that phrase used before, but I can see that the EU might argue that decision making on significant functions is something different to central management and control, and I suppose might be more akin to the core income generating activities of the entity. Okay, so we have talked about the 3 gateway conditions: geographically mobile income, cross-border activity, and outsourcing. Let's move on to talk about the gateway exclusions. The first one is an exclusion for regulated financial undertakings, which I'm sure will be of interest to the asset management industry.
Definitely. It's a broad definition and it encompasses lots of different financial undertakings, such as AIFs, UCITS, pension institutions, investment firms, and managers of AIFs.
And what about holding companies in fund structures?
No, they'd be unlikely to fall into the regulated financial undertaking exclusion, so they'd need to consider whether they fall into one of the other exclusions instead. There are also 2 exclusions for holding entities, but Both of these are limited by reference to the location of the entity's owners, so they'd need to be carefully considered on a case-by-case basis.
That's interesting. And I think it's also worth noting that there are exclusions for entities with listed securities and entities with 5 full-time employees. And I think the exclusion for entities with 5 full-time employees could be quite useful for businesses. It's interesting that there is currently no requirement there for the employees to be located in the same jurisdiction as the entity.
Yes, I agree that it's a useful exclusion. However, the wrinkle with the 5 employees exclusion is that the employees have to exclusively spend their time carrying out activities which generate relevant income. And the nature of the business might mean that there's no commercial need for 5 employees to carry out these activities. It will probably depend upon the income in question. For example, if you've got a business that's holding IP, it might need to take steps to manage its IP quite actively in order to generate royalty income. So it might need to do things to protect the IP against infringements, and there may be a fair amount of work to do around licensing the IP. In contrast, an entity that passively receives dividend income may not have a commercial need for 5 employees to carry out activities in relation to this income. So there are some quite useful exclusions, but not all businesses will fit within an exclusion. If an entity meets the 3 gateway conditions and doesn't qualify for any of the gateway exclusions, then the entity would be categorized as at risk of being a shell. What this means is that the entity will be subject to annual substance reporting requirements at step 2.